Hello, I'm Brian Critchell and I'm here today with Kevin LeGrand, who's President of the Society of Pension Consultants and also Principal and Head of Technical Services for Buck Consultants. Kevin, welcome, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And you've taken the reins at the SPC at probably the most challenging time we've ever faced in pensions. Occupational pensions as we know them, under threat, will be turned on their head if they survive at all. So how does that feel in your role as President, and what pressure does that put on the SPC and organisations like you to respond and show the way forward?
Well, personally, it's a great challenge and a great privilege actually to be involved in being the President at this time. As you say, it's a very difficult time, and that puts a lot of pressure on both me as President and the SPC as a whole. And I've sought throughout to try to make sure that the SPC continues with the practice that it's done long in the past, long before I became President, of giving sensible, apolitical, balanced advice to government and regulators and so on, to try to come up with answers to some of the problems that we face.
And what do you do if you feel that they're not taking any notice?
Well, there's only so much one can do, of course. We're not the final arbiters, not the final decision makers, but we do make sure that our views within the council, within the subcommittees and council of the SPC, are packaged and put appropriately strongly to government. And not apart from that, we also take a step back, and we also these days do lobbying at the earlier stage, so that we can hopefully catch some of the worst potential aspects of a policy if they exist before we actually start getting down the road of detail.
To try and point out the law of unintended consequences.
Indeed, yes,
of
which there's been a lot recently.
I think I'll say amen to that. With DB pensions moving rapidly to their end game, in the private sector at least, and given the general disenchantment with the replacement DC schemes and other long-term saving amongst Generation Y, where does that leave your members, whom you rely on, of course, to keep you going, whose lifeblood has been consulting and designing some often pretty complex and baffling pension arrangements and benefit plans for their client customers?
I think, first of all, you have to note that the SPC's membership is somewhat wider than just pension consultants that appear in the name. We, in fact, have members who provide services and advice and so on to clients in respect of all kinds of workplace-based pensions. So therefore, just the decline of a particular scheme design basis, if you like, doesn't necessarily mean that our members will all be out of work tomorrow. But equally, I think that there will be a number of new designs coming out in the future that will be somewhere between the old-style legacy final salary schemes and the very simple DC schemes that have tended to replace them when the changes have occurred over the last 10, 20 years. And so I think there's a lot of extra work there and a potential there for our members in designing schemes and running them. And I think that's quite right. I mean, I think that I'm not in favour, and neither is SPC, of any one particular design basis. I think it is very much horses for courses. And I think, therefore, that we will be employed gainfully for some considerable time and that sort of thing. And I think employers will be pressing us, our clients will be pressing us to come up with new designs, because I think that what's actually happened over the past decade or so with the move to DC is that it's been a kind of a rush, and I don't think it's also always been very well thought through. Either by clients and sometimes by their advisors as well. It's been sort of a tendency to follow the herd, if you like, in that sense. And I think now there's a growing understanding that actually DC doesn't tick all the boxes, and in fact, in many cases, leaves a lot of very valuable boxes unticked. And therefore, there will be pressure on us to come up with new ideas. So I think there'll be some work yet for us.
Okay, you talk about being somewhere in between two extremes, but haven't pensions become too complicated for their own good? And aren't you actually risking perpetuating the habits that we all seem to have in the industry, whether we're actually practitioners or regulators, of making it complicated and then regulating it tightly? Isn't there an opportunity for some original thinking where we could make things a lot simpler? Because we're certainly not engaging young people in particular with what we've got at the moment.
I think there is. I think that's quite right. But I think we also need to look at where the complications have come from. Certainly aspects of scheme design and some aspects actually produced by the industry, yes, have contributed to that complexity, particularly if you go back and look at some of the designs of final salary schemes and the fact that I've seen a number of them that have been tinkered with on an almost daily basis. And as a result, it's become almost impossible to administer them effectively. But also, perhaps partly generated by that and partly generated by social concerns, we've then had legislation and regulation that sought to identify aspects of those schemes and then legislate against them or regulate them and control them in some way. So I think if we go back, as you're suggesting, to a more simpler base approach again, I think we've got an opportunity to start again. And that's no bad thing. I think every now and then, over time, things do become more complex, and there's very often a good opportunity to take when it arises to actually sort of go back to first principles again. And indeed, that's only following what a good consultant would do, going into a client, a brand new client for the first time, who's come along to him and said, "I'd like a pension scheme, come and please design it for me." And when you go back to first principles, you look at the circumstances of your client, you look, in fact, probably the context, the much wider context than just the job you've been asked to do, and you try to design something that fits into that. And if you translate that into national terms, if you like, if we're looking at pensions, we should stop looking at them as being something entirely separate from any other kind of savings vehicle or any vehicle that uses up wealth in any way, and that we should put that into a sort of wider context. Having said that, I don't agree with people who wish to regard pensions as simply another savings vehicle going forward. I think there is a definite, clear objective for a pension scheme, and that shouldn't be lost, and that should form the basis of any future designs.
A plea to go back to first principles is something that I would definitely agree with, and I'm sure that others watching this will agree with you. And if we can get some evidence that that's the case, then I'll certainly let you know.
But also, of course, if we're going for simpler designs as well, we can help to actually reduce the load on trustees and what we're asking them to do. So I think there's a role to play in that as well. I think the things will sort of fit together in sort of jigsaw, if you like.
Well, spoken as the president of the Society of Pension Consultants, absolutely right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Kevin, for coming and talking to us today. Some very cogent words of wisdom here, which I hope our members will appreciate. And when you watch this video, if you are so driven, I hope you'll comment in the usual way by posting on the community, and I will ensure that your comments come back to Kevin. And of course, if you want a reply, we'll arrange one for you. So thank you very much indeed for watching. Thank you very much indeed for coming, Kevin.
Thank you.
Goodbye.